Well, I feel, Baroness Patricia Scotland, I should give you a long introduction because you've literally just walked in the door. You've been Secretary-General of the Commonwealth for 3 years. I saw that you described yourself as a classic child of the Commonwealth, with your background of being born in Dominica, then Walthamstow, then the Bar in the UK, House of Lords, and now Commonwealth. First woman to lead the Commonwealth, but before that, the youngest woman ever to be a QC, first woman of colour, first woman of colour to be a minister in a British government, first English Attorney General. I'm sure there's loads of other things that you've done for the first time, but you've probably caught your breath now. Too much breath of mine, I think. The Commonwealth is one of those things, I mean, it's a third of the planet, but I suspect most of the people in the audience, it doesn't sort of cross their radar very much. The Commonwealth Games, I guess we also grew up, if we were in the UK, watching those CHOGM, those Commonwealth heads of government meetings that would happen every couple of years in some exotic location. But other than that, it doesn't figure very prominently in a lot of the, on the news or in the conversations we have. How have you used it to support equality and change people's lives?
Well, the most important thing is to remember what you've just said, that this is 1/3 of the world's population. That's 2.4 billion people, 60% of whom are under the age of 30. And if you look at the spread of those countries, they are some of the smallest countries in the world. A country like Nauru in the Pacific, 10,000 people, and some of the biggest countries in the world, India, 1.2 billion people. But within this family, every single member state is equal. So that is equality of a new dimension. Everyone has the same vote, everyone sits at the same table, and everyone has the same right to be heard. And in the Commonwealth, we have 31 of the 39 small states in the world. So it's the only organization where, because of equality, 31 small states could technically outvote everybody else, which means that you get a very collaborative, responsive, respectful approach to those who are saying something different to you or come from a different space. And the Commonwealth is really brought together by our values. It is not an organization to which anyone has to belong. All these sovereign states come together, they choose to come together. Anybody could leave at any time. You could wake up in the morning tomorrow and go, I'm out of here. And you would be out, simply because you no longer wanted to stay. But what we've found is, because this is an alignment of countries who come together because of their values, because of their principles, because of their belief in equality, those who have gone have all asked to come back. So now this is an even stronger alignment of countries who have been able to come to an agreement at a time when multilateralism is really under threat. So many of us are being encouraged to be nationalistic, narrow-minded, self-absorbed and self-interested. And here in the Commonwealth, it's a really multilateral platform where people want to be open, they're sharing their data, they are looking at how we can make the human condition greater. Hugely important for all of us is climate change. The Commonwealth was the first organization in 1989 that said climate change posed an existential threat to all of us, but particularly to the small states. And I think the reason for that is actually quite clear, because so many people want this esoteric, scientific discussion about whether climate change is real or not. If you're living in a small state and you are seeing your land erode, if you're watching the sea level rise and take away things that you've had your whole life. If you've ever lived through an experience, as unfortunately some people in my own country of birth, Dominica, did in 2017, where a hurricane doesn't just take your building and your materials, but they take your children. There's this horrible, horrible story of a young mother with a 5-year-old who she was holding tight to his hand. And by the time Hurricane Maria had finished, that child was ripped from her arms. And even today, 2 years later, she's going around saying to people, "Have you seen my son? Have you seen my son?" Because she doesn't believe that he's gone, and she wants someone to tell her, so that at least if they could find him, they could bury him. Or you watch a woman who has just celebrated her 9-year-old child's birthday, and they've had the most magnificent house, and they've worked on it really hard, and the hurricane comes and takes it all of it. And she's sitting on a step, a stone step, which is the only thing left. And when I go to see her, she says, "I'm praising God because I still have my life, I still have my son, and I still have my husband. And many of my friends now have nothing." So this is the reality of what climate change is doing on small states. And the Commonwealth has been coming together, listening and trying to help our member states to do better. And that's why you'll find the small states are climate change warriors, because they know the reality of what is going to come. And that's all about equality, because we're having some real challenges now.
And I can see that's the strength of the Commonwealth is the diversity.
Yeah.
And particularly an issue like climate change, you encompass within the membership countries on all sides of the climate change equation, and you very vividly described. But when you're thinking about equality and some of the issues we're going to be talking about in the next couple of days, it also includes, you have diverse countries in regards to their legal situation, whether they respect, a lot of the 54 countries still have the death penalty, a lot have not got full protections for LGBTQ, and you don't have often very full legal rights and for women, freedom to do jobs they want, freedom from persecution and from violence. How do you force change the membership without becoming an ex-Secretary General of the Commonwealth?
Well, I think one of the most powerful things that we can do is to walk with people. And what we've been able to do is actually make the economic case for human rights and for inclusion. And let me give you an example of how that is. We almost flatlined in terms of growth, global growth, 2 or 3 years ago. And we were at the lowest level we had ever been since 1945. Growth was about 2%. We then were working really hard to improve that, and we went up to 3.7%. When we disaggregated that 3.7% to try and understand what had been responsible for the growth, it was those countries who had invested in their human capital who had grown. So there is a clear economic message. If you discriminate unfairly against any group, you disable yourself from taking advantage of being a truly wealthy country. And I remember saying to a group of people, "Do you want to be rich?" And they said, yes. "Do you want to be seriously, disgustingly, obscenely rich?" And they said, "That sounds even better." Well, the way you do that is by being fair. Because if you discriminate unfairly, you deprive yourself of the talent, the energy, and the opportunity. 50% of our world is female. So if we are going to discriminate unfairly against that 50%, we are going to materially disadvantage our ability to do it. And we are, in the Commonwealth, able to take advantage of a number of things. We have the same common law, we have the same common language, we have the same parliamentary structure, we have the same institutions. And therefore, if we can come up with a method which works for one of us, it is likely that it could work for another. So we're doing things like equalizing the law, working with our countries to try and help a new construct to be adopted, and they are coming with us on that.
But I mean, forgive me, when you talk about the Commonwealth, and it does sound lovely, you know, it's all voluntary and collaborative and nobody gets forced to do anything they don't want to do. How do you get anything done in that environment?
By vested interests. So let me give you an example of what I did in relation to domestic violence, which we are now replicating in the Commonwealth. When I was the Minister for Criminal Justice in 2003, I was faced with the task of eliminating domestic violence and reducing crime. It's just in the UK, England, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Oh, that's all right.
So
Yeah.
in fact, I went in to see Tony Blair and he said to me, I've only got two things for you to do, Patricia. One is you have to eliminate domestic violence, and the other, sort out our crime.
Could have been worse, could have been Europe.
Yeah. So I thought, well, yeah, what should I do in the afternoon then? So one of the things I asked was, well, what sort of crime do we have? And what I discovered is that we had a very high rate of domestic violence. We had 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men, and between 750 and 950,000 children were adversely affected by domestic violence at some stage in our lives. I also found that when I looked at the criminal justice system and looked at the women's prisons, 89% of the women in prison had a history of domestic violence or sexual assault. And then when I looked at the death rate, I found that 120 women were being killed every year by their partner or their ex-partner. That was 2 or 3 women a week. I then looked at who I had in my juvenile estate, and I found that almost 90% of the children in the juvenile estate came from domestic violence homes. And then I looked at my male estate, and more than 74% of the men in my male estate had graduated from the juvenile estate. So right in the middle of all this dysfunction was domestic violence. And I was told there wasn't anything you can do about it. It's like the poor. It's with us always. Well, I didn't believe that. So what we did is we did something that hadn't been done before. Everyone always tells you can't do anything about it because we have no money. So I asked a different question. Instead of how much money don't we have, how much money are we currently spending on domestic violence? And they came up with a frightening figure. And I wanted an irreducible minimum, because there are statistics, and then there's damned lies that nobody believes. So I wanted a figure that was bulletproof. They came up with £23.1 billion every year.
And that's not spent directly on domestic violence programs, but on the consequences.
On the consequences. So it's, for example, I was the criminal justice minister. So domestic violence was costing me £1 billion of my budget. So every single murder was about £1 million. I had a number of the deaths. I had people in my criminal justice system, actual bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, children taken sick. All of those elements was costing me £1 billion. But it was costing health £1.2 billion, not including the children and not including mental health. So what we did is we worked out that government was spending £3.1 billion, but business was spending £2.7 billion on loss of profitability. And because we found that those who were victims were absent from work 4 or 5 times a month, late for work 4 or 5 times a month. Often they were present but not present, and they would leave. And a lot of the abuse was happening in the workplace or near the workplace. So together we created a multi-agency, multi-risk approach where by 2010 we had reduced domestic violence by 64%. But the thing that chancellors are always much more interested in is we had reduced the cost by £7.1 billion a year. So for every £1 we were spending, we were saving 6. So if you can come up with an economic model, implementation model that makes sense, then you find that people are much more interested in changing behavior. Because lots of people would love to do things, but they don't know how, or they're saying, I have no money. So what we're doing in the Commonwealth now is we are taking the learning that we have from that experience, and we're now rolling it out across the Commonwealth, helping our member states to make the economic analysis as to how much money they're spending, helping them to disaggregate those figures, helping them to put in place the sort of highly successful response, and it is working. And as far as LGBTI is concerned, we are taking a very thoughtful but quite assertive set of procedures. We have encouraged and enabled many member states to have parliamentary champions to champion these issues, to raise them. We are levelling the law, and those countries who wish to do it, we are helping them to craft laws which are neutral, which talks about citizens as opposed to black citizens or white citizens or female citizens or citizens with a disability or citizens who are gay or straight. And if you concentrate on the equality of the citizen, and if your legislation focuses on the citizen, then it's very difficult to discriminate unfairly. And if you've looked at what we have managed to do with the changes in legislation in countries like the Seychelles and like Belize and elsewhere, there have now been constitutional challenges when courts have said, no, you cannot behave in this way because it is non-constitutional to discriminate, because now the Constitution says a citizen and does not differentiate between those citizens, be they male, female, abled, disabled, gay, straight, black, white, religious, non-religious. It takes time and it takes patience, but it's working.
Well, and I saw you just got an award for your services to women's empowerment, which is a pretty nice one to have on the mantelpiece. Look, we're going to run out of time, but I have also wanted to ask you one more slightly more personal question, because you and I probably both agree about the power of numbers, and if you show people the numbers, it's the single best investment you can make is in educating girls and the power of equality and being fair. But it's also about how people in senior roles are treated and what it's like for a senior woman, particularly ones who are sort of trailblazing as you did. One tends to notice, particularly women of colour, who reach senior positions in the UK, maybe particularly in the bar, but not just in the bar, there's an aspect to the reporting on them. You've been Baroness Brazen.
Yeah.
A friend of mine, Baroness Flanders, is known as Shrieky Shreety. There's always that kind of tone. How do you handle that? I mean, if you come across that as in your experience, is it just too much to get into, or do you call people on it every time? How do you cope?
I think it's really difficult because you cannot control how other people behave towards you and treat you. The only thing you have control over is your response. And what I find is people want to use these pejorative terms to diminish you, to hurt you, to derail you, and to make you feel less able to do things. I mean, women are called arrogant. Men are called assertive. Women are called brazen. Men are called bold and courageous. And so I think...
Let's not get into bossy.
Yeah. And I think it is something which I so desperately hope will change. Everyone's always interested in what we're wearing. No one seems to notice what the men are wearing. I mean, if we started to say, there's a very delicious man on the second row wearing a blue shirt with a little button and most elegant glasses, and the smile was quite devastating. But who was he? These different sexist sort of presentations, I think, can be very demoralizing, can be very destabilizing, and I think people who tell you that they're not hurtful are not telling you the whole truth, because all of us have the capacity to be deeply hurt by the unfair, pejorative things that are said about us. But then you come to a realization that if the purpose of saying these quite disgusting things sometimes about you is to stop you from doing that which you know you should do, you then have a choice as to whether you're going to allow them to succeed. And I know a number of people have thought, you know, they've said it to me directly, Patricia, you're crazy. Why are you doing this? And the reason is the fact that someone has to. And if all the decent people run away, and it's only the egotists and those who are self-serving who remain, then they win. And I think I've always been ready to lose. I've just never been willing not to fight. And so I think if any of us wants to change the world, and most of us do, we have to be willing to fight. And we have to be willing to say, not in my name. And so you cannot control what other people say or do to you, but you can control your response. And what I have found is being polite and continuing to smile kills them.
Fantastic. I think you've given us a lot of inspiring thoughts for driving us through the next day and a half. But thank you very much, Baroness Patricia Scotland.